I'm gonna hit record. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Converge's fourth special speaker series. Our topic today that we will be covering is team building in virtual, hybrid, and everything in between. So we have two guest speakers here today, Paul Gaskell and Parul Agarwal, and then Mark Izzo, the founder and president of Converge HR Solutions, will be monitoring the event. I just wanted to make a suggestion to changing your view to speaker view so you can see Mark, Paul, or Parul when they are speaking, because we made the event a team meeting and instead of a presenter meeting, because we do want to have some engagement and be able to have people ask questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and or let me know, and I can jump in and interrupt them so that we can get those questions asked and answered. Great. All right, so I will give it over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, please use the chat feature. Anna will be monitoring that for questions and comments. We've already indicated that we're recording this session. It'll be sent out to everyone afterwards. We envision it being about an hour. We've scheduled a little bit more time than that, so we have some flexibility, but we want to be cautious and considerate of folks' times. And then if you're not speaking or asking a question, please mute, simply because sometimes we'll get feedback and want to minimize that. As Anna said earlier, just a moment ago, we're going to talk about team building and the challenges that we're facing in the current environment, where people are completely remote, working hybrid, some working in the office, etc. Look forward to Parul and Paul's expertise, as well as tips on how we manage these challenges moving forward. Quick, short summary bio for each. Parul Agarwal is passionate about transforming everyday leadership into exceptional leadership. She focuses on supporting leaders on their leadership journey by coaching around accountability, honesty, and awareness. Parul specializes in multiple areas, including executive coaching, strategic advising, and leadership and business coaching. Paul Gaskell has a passion around developing individuals and teams. He comes from a background in IT, which helps in his delivery of successful business solutions, completion of major outsourcing programs, and development of new processes. There's more than 3 decades of experience with real-world expertise in leading, coaching, and facilitating. So with that being said, I'm going to jump in here to moderating this discussion. I have a series of questions that I'll ask, and we'll make it as interactive as possible. So let's start with sort of laying some groundwork here before we get to quote unquote team building. I'd like to get both panelists sets of sort of the summarizing the current state of the workforce today, given that we're 2+ years out from the start of the pandemic and still running into those challenges. So Parul, can you summarize the current state for us?
Absolutely. I would say ever-changing. When you think about what has happened in the last 2 years, it's the game, the rules, everything has changed. And so for us to kind of look back in our toolkit of how things used to be, or some things that have worked in the past, we have to be open to the fact that it's ever-changing. So I would say open-mindedness and nimbleness is what's going to help us as we look forward. That's how I would summarize it right now.
Perfect. Thank you. Paul, I'd ask the same of you.
Yeah, I think the easy answer is it depends on the organization, but I think every organization has felt some impact. And I think kind of where we are now is there's a whole range of different responses to kind of coming out of the last 2 years. And in some cases, I've seen that there's not a rush to return to work in some organizations that I'm aware of, but others are like a full court press on, let's get back into the office. I think somewhere in between. I was at my dentist yesterday, and I overheard somebody talking about the hybrid, and I didn't realize that was a certain expression, but maybe it is. And I think a lot of organizations are headed to that in terms of thinking about working 2 or 3 days a week in the office. And there's a lot probably to be said about the 2 or 3 days, and maybe we'll cover that, about maybe the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. But that's my sense of kind of where we are right now.
One of the things that I've read a lot about, I'm sure we all have, is this question around how productive folks working remotely are or have been. And I just like your take on that, Paul, as a follow-up to that initial question. There are some leaders, managers, et cetera, who feel that, you need to be in the office in front of me to be productive, and with your colleagues. And then there are other managers who may be a little bit more flexible there. But do we have any knowledge or any specific statistics around,
Yeah.
how the hybrid or how the remote workforce has fared during the last 2.5 years in terms of productivity?
Sure, happy to talk about that. So there's a professor at Stanford who's been looking at this stuff for much more than 2 years. Guy's name's Nick Bloom. He's appeared a couple of times on some Adam Grant podcasts, and his research pre-pandemic was that I think he did this with a organization, tech organization in China, was that people who had worked at home 2 days a week were 13% more productive than people who had been kind of in the office all of the time, which led that company to go for a kind of a hybrid model before the pandemic. I think there is some question about what is the nature of the work as well, which kind of plays into this, which is that if you are sort of an individual contributor, so if you're the references he talks about are, you're working in a call center or you're working as an accountant, then that makes it much easier to do your work kind of individually. And then maybe some environments where it's harder because you need to be more collaborative, but there's no, despite what maybe Elon Musk, or to quote him, who talked about people pretending to work at home, there is quite a lot of evidence that there's no loss of productivity from people working at home, kind of almost whatever the complexion of their work is.
Thank you. Parul, what's your take on that?
So I agree with Paul, a lot of the same research. I think that what's also just really interesting is the different layers that we have to include in that thought process. And now it's productivity, mental health, just family obligations. Like there's so many things that have changed for people that studies like Gallup and Harvard Business Review, so many different ways of slicing this onion. I think what's really fascinating is how at the end of the day, in my opinion, in my coaching, Paul, would love your thoughts. It comes down to my own, as a person who may be working, I have to have accountability and there has to be trust. So I don't know if that, is always how all of the different research models look at it, but at least in my experience, when there's a level of trust and a level of accountability on both sides, the right approach based on the work, the industry, doesn't matter. It shows up in the way that continues to show productivity. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, so I think that trust thing is really important. I think kind of more modern research about how teams develop places a lot of emphasis on creating kind of safety and an environment where people can feel vulnerable. And I think there is a risk around leaders demanding that people come back to work full time, that they're actually articulating, maybe explicitly in some cases, a message that the people who work there aren't to be trusted. Sorry, so that was the end of my sentence. I apologize.
So as a follow-up to that, I have I've read a bunch about this, and I'm sure, like I said, others probably have as well, is that while you indicate that they're more productive at home, um, at the same time, there's this, I'm working 24/7. I'm, I can't get out of my office. I'm tied to my computer, my laptop, my phone, so forth and so on. What are your thoughts around that? I mean, there has to be, I've seen it in my own household. I can give some examples of it. There's a point at which we become burnt out and less productive potentially. What are your thoughts on that, Parul?
It's a really great point. I think of that whole evolution of how things never stay the same. I don't know if anyone else can agree, but when the pandemic first started, obviously none of us really knew what was really happening, but we wanted to continue our work. And so we found that we had all this extra time. We're like, we don't have to commute. Look how fantastic this is. I can have lunch with my spouse. I can make sandwiches for my kids. But then as time continued to tick, that time slowly but surely has been taken. So I know for even someone who owns their own business, I can go days where I realize at 6:30 that I haven't had lunch, or that I have completely failed to leave my office. So if it's happening to someone who controls their schedule, I can't imagine what it's like for everybody who doesn't control that schedule. It's definitely an interesting shift. And I think that comes back to leaders who are really aware of what their people need, and kind of helping to draw parameters when parameters aren't being drawn.
Paul, I'd
Yeah, I
like your
think
thoughts on that as well. It's a big issue, this 24/7 and burnout, and I'd like to hear what you have to say.
yeah, I think the point about kind of leaders checking in with with people, their employees, to understand, kind of where that is an issue, where people aren't stepping away. That is really important. But I, I think because I think it probably is more of a case by case basis. Because I've certainly seen where people have gone to a hybrid model that people are kind of sending emails at all times of the day, and and that might seem like, oh, they're working 24/7, but in some cases I think what that is about is introducing a level of flexibility. So if I'm at home on a Wednesday or a Friday, I don't need to be at my desk because I've done my kind of intense meetings when I've been in the office, and therefore, it gives me flexibility maybe to have lunch with someone that I may not have otherwise been, but it may show up in my emails coming, kind of in the evening or earlier in the morning. So I do think, yeah. So I think that there are definitely opportunities that are created, but I think having leaders check in and make sure that the good version of this is happening, and not I'm totally chained to my computer and I'm working every hour I've got, is important.
Yeah, I think you're right, and the underlying thought here is that, at least that I'm taking away from the discussion that we're having currently, is that there needs to be a real leadership mind shift, change. And there's a new normal that leaders and organizations need to be aware of. We have a very good client, and one of the questions, or one of the comments that this person often makes, is just ask them. And it's so basic, right? But it eludes leaders all the time. It's just ask them, like, have a discussion about what's working and what's not, and what can we do for you? How can we do it better? How could you be more productive without burning out yourself and your family and so forth? So big issues there, for sure. Moving on. So we've talked a lot about sort of what the current state is. What additional, doing a little visioning here, what additional changes do you see on the horizon, Paul?
Well, I don't know if I have a very good track record as a seer, but I'll sort of do my best. I think it will. I think it depends on the organization. But I do see some examples of organizations kind of much more likely to hire without recourse to location. So being more concerned about finding the right person rather than necessarily the person who happens to be in the right geography. Um, I think in most organizations, a lot of organizations, I don't want to say most, that will get to a best practice, which is that sort of 2 or 3 days in the office. And to your point about just ask, I think that will ideally be like 2 to 3 days that people agree on and understand are the best for the organization, and that are in sync, rather than kind of leaving it to a free for all, which has some kind of challenging consequences, I think. And I think there's some work being done, at least at Harvard. It's probably been in other places now, looking at where certain work is done best. And I've certainly seen some of this work talk about like the assumption has always been that complex work has to take place in person, and there's some counter to that now, which is saying, well, actually, complex work is best done asynchronously, where people are really prepared to kind of do the work and understand, because they've understood all the background, and that in some cases might actually be better done remotely than it is done in person. So I think there's some other things. There's more that I'm sure we'll talk about, but there's some of the things that I think we'll see in a lot of organizations.
Roll, what are you saying?
So I agree with Paul, but I kind of think of it like a pendulum. I feel like we were in this place where that pendulum swung really far. I think it's going to find a way back to the middle. What exactly that middle looks like, to Paul's point, I wish I was a seer, or more so of a seer, but I do believe that the indications that I'm seeing, and just clients that I work with, there's this balance that will be found, and it won't be perfect because it wasn't perfect pre-pandemic. I'm not sure if people have forgotten how it was before pandemic, right? We were still working 50, 60 hours a week. A lot of people complained about, work-life balance. So it was a challenge before. There's just new layers on this cake. But I do think that the pendulum is going to come back as it slowly, in my, research and my own experience with clients, it's coming back. We have to find out when do we hit the middle, so that we can all settle down a little bit.
Got it. And to that point, where, and I know we're visioning again here, and our crystal ball may be hazy, but where does the employees' need for flexibility fall in all of this, right? So I just purchased some expensive real estate, right? Redid my office building. All of the leaders are in the office every day, and we want everyone back, but we have an employee population that's looking for a certain level of flexibility. How does that all shake out? Parul, what do you think?
So I know it's an odd analogy, but kind of think about parenting. If we got to decide exactly how everything was going to be because we're the boss, and it's how it's going to be done because we said so, I think all of our kids would never get in trouble, right? Like they have the mind of their own. And I don't mean to say that, adults are children. I'm saying that mentality that because I said so, I don't know if that's going to continue to hold true in organizations where the culture is truly about how can I be there for you from a leadership perspective? What do you need? Because again, it has a lot to do with the industry, the type of work. If a surgeon started to say, well, I'm going to be remote, I don't know how we would all feel about that. We have to be willing to understand that in some cases it's not a possibility, but where there is, being able to have an honest, vulnerable conversation and have people hear you is where I think it's going to need to be as we look in the future.
Paul, I'd like to talk a little bit now as a follow-up to what Parul just mentioned around organizational leadership, because so much of what we've discussed in the first 20-25 minutes of this session has been around leadership mindset, leadership flexibility, leadership asking the questions of what you need, leaders leading by example. I can go on and on and on. So why don't we talk a little bit, Paul, about organizational leadership and what you see sort of now and moving forward.
Yeah. So obviously we touched on there's a lot of leaders who are pushing kind of more than their employees are to get people back into their office, and whether that's driven by kind of real estate concerns or as we touched on earlier, sort of an underlying lack of trust is definitely a question. I think some of the most important things, if I'm a leader in an organization, to think about are how to attract kind of new talent and how to retain the people that you have, because again, there is some evidence that retention rates are high in a where people have the flexibility to kind of work at home, whether that's a hybrid or whether that's kind of full time. So I think understanding that's a really good thing to be aware of. Probably a couple of other things to be aware of, and there's some evidence that in organizations where the leaders are really keen on people coming back to the office, that some workers find it easier to kind of go in every day that the leader's there. There does appear to be some kind of presence bias, that people who are present for more of the time get more recognition, which I think can end up being really problematic if you think about the people who maybe have less flexibility, or maybe around their family or whatever it is. So I think there's kind of an awareness of people like generally like flexibility, and there's some kind of generational things here as well, that there's some surveying which suggests that millennials are even more in favor of remote working than the kind of older generations. So being aware of that in terms of attraction of new people and retaining others, but then also being aware of kind of what's going into decisions about promotion and rewards.
Thank you. Parul, I'd like your thoughts on leadership as well.
So I would also say that in this evolution, the function of HR also has a lot to do, as I say this to the HR professionals. I believe that concept of doing annual performance reviews, where you then realize that the productivity wasn't where it needed to be because goals and KPIs, they weren't met. That's where it's leadership, because if there's more conversations to Paul's earlier point, to be able to have more check-ins one-on-one, how are you doing? I think that there's a way to understand how are things progressing, and in that becomes the opportunity for that culture to flourish, because people feel valued, and it doesn't feel like I'm just a check in the box. I think that that's what leadership to me, and in my experience currently, it has to be involved, and it has to be on all sides. So I know we're talking a lot about leadership, and this by thought process, we think of that as the CEO or the VPs of the organization. I think all of us are leaders. Every person has to be able to vocalize what they need and how they need it in a way that's both balanced and reasonable and doable. And if we can find that, and both sides of the table bring leadership to the table, imagine how more productive these conversations could be.
Interesting insight. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about employee engagement. Big issue, been talking about it for a long time. We all know what the Gallup results tell us each year. It's been pretty much flat for a pretty long time. Approximately 65 to 70% of employees are disengaged in some level, meaning there's a 35% engagement level. Has this changed? Not the numbers specifically, but the concept. How has it changed and evolved through the pandemic? Because we've been a remote company before it was cool, but I think that companies that weren't remote and this was thrust upon them, they probably struggled with engaging employees. So Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a big topic. Well, I think we've touched on a couple of things that are relevant to the conversation about employee engagement. I think one certainly is kind of as a minimum having leaders checking in with people and understanding kind of how they're doing when they're working remotely and what their experience is super important. I do think it is interesting that those retention numbers seem to be better for, and this is kind of through the pandemic for uh, workers who are working from home, as opposed to those that are kind of working face to face. Um, I so I don't know a general answer, but the specific answer I give about employee engagement is I think where teams have given time through the pandemic to consciously connect outside of specific work items have seemed to have flourished more than those. So as an example, I have a client who um, was hired during the pandemic and has only ever really been in sort of transactional meetings with her team and her leader, and you know, she's basically thinking of leaving the organization because she's not felt particularly engaged. And I don't want to pretend that one team building session would have solved it, but I certainly think a philosophy of like, how do we make people feel connected to the organization, to the team, in a way that that they can't automatically by being together in person. Now,
Parul, I notice you shaking your head there at some of those points. I'd like your thoughts on employee engagement as well.
I think again, it's such a gamut in terms of how different it is organization by organization. But the ones that I can use as an example, I have a client whose team wasn't necessarily turning on their cameras, and they would have meetings, and sometimes there would be no words from certain people because, you know, they didn't have anything to say. So you couldn't see them and you didn't hear them. After those calls, that particular leader that I have been working with, he would call those people and be, how are you doing? How's it going? And in that check-in, sometimes he would learn that for them, they've got kids and a dog and things going on that they didn't want to distract other people. And so in their quest to be respectful, it actually came across in some cases the opposite. So what he started doing was having some meetings where they would meet in the park, and some people would go for walks, and they would have their meetings in different places where it was okay to have your dog and it was okay to bring your kid in a stroller. And people in those environments felt like they were not just a number on a ticket taker. They actually were, it was personalized. And I think that willingness to kind of really listen and figure out what is necessary so that their dynamic, and you can't do 100% of anything on anything, but if there's at least a little bit of a lean in, you would be surprised at how much more engagement employees have when they actually feel like they matter, that my situation matters, that they cared enough to understand. It's a sometimes it sounds like a small thing, but it can actually be the difference between staying, collaborating, engaging, or leaving, to Paul's point, where you just don't feel like your boss or colleagues or anybody really cares who you are. You're just there to submit work on a daily basis. So I think it's an opportunity to meet people where they are, is what I would say.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me ask a general question, and I don't know that we can paint this with a broad brush. But Parul, what are you seeing in terms of, is there a generational divide back to the sort of the workplace flexibility, remote work, hybrid work in the office every day? Do you see differences along generational lines and preferences there?
I definitely do. And I don't know if it's just related to this particular challenge. I think that it's there's a different age range where there's a higher level of vocalness or willingness to say what they're thinking versus older generations where we're like, how do I say this? Or should I say this? It really depends on what the organization does and who their target demographic of employees are. But yes, I definitely see a shift in how some of the thinking seems to kind of balance. I have a client that they have a lot of millennials, and what's really interesting is that particular CEO, she gets really frustrated because on Instagram, she can see these posts by a lot of her employees where they're getting coffee and they're doing all these things. And she's like, I don't feel like they're engaged because they've decided that every day is like Saturday. And it's one of those things that you're using old thinking and you're working with new thinking. And if there's no willingness to have a discussion and a conversation, I think that those divides are only going to continue to become more obvious and more challenging for leaders, because there is a difference. And just think about the type of commercials we see, or what they consider, TV 14. When I was growing up, TV 14 today would have been like MA, and you would have needed like your mom to take you to go see that on television. It's just different. And I think that people have to be willing at an organizational level to recognize how do they meet their people where they are.
Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm much to add on that, because I think that there are definitely differences. I think there are also differences in terms of people's desire to kind of work from home, that are based on race, on gender as well. And I think they are probably worth factoring in to any organization's kind of plan for how they do hybrid going forward, or people who are demanding like a full return to work. What are the consequences on people who may feel disadvantaged by being in person?
Interesting. Just thinking back pre-pandemic for a moment, and we're talking about team building here, employee engagement. We've talked about leadership and flexibility and generational differences. How did we do at team building prior to pandemic, when everyone was in the office? Paul, why don't you take the lead on that one?
Sure. Well, I guess it was. So I think one of the two things one is it was much easier, obviously, because you kind of get people together to do the team building. But what I would say is, I don't know how highly it was valued by every employee. I can think of some organizations where team building would generate a lot of eye rolls, kind of back then. So I think part of it being easier meant that people didn't necessarily value it in a way that I feel like I see more of now in the organizations that I come across.
Interesting. Parul, what's your take on that?
I agree 100% with Paul. I mean, I'm reflecting even on my own corporate experience, and I give credit to the desire to let's find new ways to connect, but it did come with an eye roll. So when you said that, Paul, I was like, yeah, I remember that, because it didn't feel personal. It didn't feel intentional. It felt like required, and it felt like it was a check in the box of some sort. But I think that, I don't know, even now, if I meet someone for coffee right now versus how I did before pandemic, it's a different experience. And I think that teams, the ones that I know I work with right now, there's a different level of engagement, a different desire to connect, because they also know it's a bit of a commodity. For how many months did we not have that? I think that there's a different mindset. So in my experience, again, it's a small sample size in terms of, what, Gallup or other people look at. But I would tell you that the teams genuinely want to be better, because they genuinely want to work together better. And they understand that not everybody's in the office every day. So if you have this opportunity to be in front of them, even if it's virtual, take it. And they do take it. So I see, some of the measures that we may put in place before a team building versus after, and you kind of reflect back with the leadership, there's definitive shifts that I don't remember seeing prior to pandemic, so quick, so deep, so sustainable. And again, like I said, sample size might be a bit of a question mark, but at least in my experience, that's what I'm seeing. Paul, what about for you?
Yeah, similar, and I think you're right to talk about sample size, because this is not every organization, but certainly. So I do some work with a company in the UK called Red 10, who have a team effectiveness product, and so they did some specific things to the product to make it virtual, and I think there's some value in looking at what those were. But the thing I would say is the kind of events they've done subsequently, and certainly my interaction with some of the clients who've been to those meetings, is people just super excited to finally meet, colleagues from maybe the other parts of the side of the world, to be able to kind of get to know them. And Parul, this is a word you had used when we talked about this, that like to bond. And I don't know if people would have talked about bonding if you'd have asked them about getting together with their colleagues pre-pandemic. Maybe some people would, but it certainly felt like there was much more investment from people in the more recent kind of team meetings that I've been kind of party to or observed.
So given what you both just described, what are the best and brightest companies doing now in the world we live in? And what are they looking forward to doing in the future as it relates to team building based on hybrid work, remote work completely, geographical dispersion, people working across the country, not anywhere near the corporate headquarters? Sort of what does that vision look like?
That's a big question.
So
I think where this is, so this is a bit of the SEER thing again, but I think where it's headed is for large organizations. The one thing that everyone can agree on is that there's real value in getting people together, whether it's 4 times a year or whatever the number is, to really focus in on kind of what are we about, what are our goals, how are we going to work together. So whether you go down a path of we'll need to be in the office all the time, or whether we're going to be as remote as we possibly can, I think that sort of activity, like the regularly scheduled get together, takes on I think people can be more committed to it, and it takes on a kind of, I think, a higher value than it would have done pre-pandemic. So I think that's one of the building blocks which I would see as good practice for organizations, especially if you're going down a path of hiring people irrespective of geography. So that would be a start. Parul, what are your thoughts?
I mean, so I agree. Just kind of giving it more of a tactical piece. When you think about how we're talking about leaders and connecting and being more, attuned to what your staff needs, I think that when I reflect on my own experiences or my experiences as a coach or facilitator, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, having like these interesting workshops that were like individual, like let's do this, let's talk about that. It was fine, but it was that it kind of fed that feeling that it was checks in the box. Where post-pandemic, or I wish I could really say it's post-pandemic. I don't know if I can say that. Post the worst part, please be true, of the pandemic is that a lot of the work I'm doing with leaders is where we're building. So we take a foundational approach to engagement with their staff, whether they're virtual or in person, or in some cases I, facilitate where they're both, right? There's some people in the room and some people who can't be in the room, but creating programs where they take, let's say, strengths. So Erica, I know you and I have talked about this, but I'm a Gallup coach. So if we talk about strengths, you can have a 1 hour conversation, you can have an 8-hour workshop, but if that's where it stops, that's where it stops. But instead, I work with organizations where they start talking about it, they understand it, and then they just build. And what I'm seeing is more meaningful engagement from their staff because they're getting to know each other in a vulnerable way. It's not just Thursday afternoon team building, conversation that comes with eye rolls or challenges because I have to go to the office. It becomes something they look forward to in these meetings. And sometimes it's as many as say 50 people. I do these meetings in person, and in some cases, like I said, every single person shows up. And I will tell you, pre-pandemic, there were always a handful of people that just couldn't make it. I think that there's a level of commitment that's shifted because they feel like they're connected to something bigger. So that's my observation. Paul, have you seen any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I've seen has really been successful in the remote, the virtual team effectiveness work that I've seen is spending time on kind of understanding kind of who everybody is, and strength is obviously one way of strengths finder is one way of doing that, but I've also seen a couple of different tools where folks create a single slide that sort of with images that sort of shows. I mean, you ask a series of questions about like kind of who are you and kind of what are the things that are important to you, and then how do you need other people to treat you, what works for you, and that really opens up. I've seen that really open up a lot of like kind of sort of better ways of allowing people to work together than simply showing up in that transactional way I described before. And I think there's a lot more receptivity to it than there was pre-pandemic as well.
So it sounds like we're using a lot more creative methodology for how we actually engage employees, conduct team building exercises and so forth, rather than everyone sitting in the conference room checking off the box with the eyes rolling, as you indicated before. So that's a good sign. Let me ask a sort of an interesting question, at least from my perspective, because we have clients that are considered life-sustaining businesses, and they've not been able to a large extent to work remotely. So maybe 85% of their employee population is in the office every day, and 15% can work remote because of their jobs. What dynamics do you see there, Parul, if you've seen them at all?
I mean, from my exposure to it, I think it comes back to culture of the leadership and the organization. If it's something where I have something they don't mentality, it can cause really big rifts in the team and the feeling of connectivity and the willingness to connect. That whole concept of bonding, right, Paul? Like you don't feel the desire to do it because you feel like they have something you don't. But if it's done in a way that is flexible and is it isn't because you have to be here and it's because I said so. It's you were here because we need you and you want to be here. And I know that, there's so many challenges with just staffing and keeping all the people on your team. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, I went to the gas station the other day and they were closed because they didn't have anyone to work it. I was like, what is happening? So I know that it's bigger than what I'm saying, but I do feel like the teams that can, manage their way through it, Mark, are the ones that create a space where it isn't, you over me, it's we. And how do we do this so that it works for that person, that team, that situation? So I don't know if it's an actual answer to your question, but I do think that it comes down to culture in a lot of organizations. It's how do you feel you're being treated compared to other people? And if you feel like there's a gap, that gap's only going to get bigger until you leave.
Good thoughts, and the issue of just staff shortages adds to the complexity of it, right? Just read this morning that American Airlines, due to a lack of pilots, had to cancel like 3 trips that they have been running for years and years and years. They have grounded planes and not enough people. So, and there's a life-sustaining business, right? I mean, the airlines really never shut down. They slowed down significantly. But Paul, what are your thoughts on that sort of 85-15, 85 of the people have to be in the business because it's a life-sustaining business, and 15% of the people can work from home. What kind of dynamic have you seen?
Yeah, frankly, most of my clients and my exposure is to people who have been able to work at home. But I am aware that, like, I think it's 50% of kind of American workers don't have that luxury, or haven't had that luxury. And the one thing that I've certainly read about is, how to kind of maintain, how to, I guess, reward people who are in person all of the time and haven't had the choice. And one of the interesting ideas that I did see was giving people kind of extra days for personal development, where they could actually be at home and do some well, personal development stuff that was particularly relevant to them, as a way of making people feel not excluded from the opportunity to work at home, which I thought was an interesting idea.
Yeah, again, back to the creativity issue. There seems to be a thread there of
Yeah.
just leaders needing to be more creative with a workforce that has to be at work every day, and with the workforce that doesn't have to be at work every day. We just have to engage them on a more creative level, it seems.
Mark, can I add to that
Please.
really quickly? I have a client that has that situation, and I don't know if it's an 85-15, it could be 75-25 kind of thing. But because of that desire to make it feel like it's, it's not a have to, it's this is how we need it. Can you help us get that done? He started giving car allowances to people who had to come into the office. And so those that worked from home, if that's a luxury you have, fantastic. But for those that we need you here, we really need you here. And so just that small gesture has changed so much of a disposition, because not only was he listening, but because he tried to find a way to make it more balanced. Again, it doesn't mean A equals A. It just means that based on, the cards on the table, the hands that they're both playing seems a little bit more fair, because you can't work from home and be like, well, how come I didn't get a car allowance? And if you're going into the office and you're getting the car allowance, you're not like, well, wow, how come I can't work at home? It's a little bit more, it feels less like you're different and more like you're all treated the same.
Yeah, car allowance, transit passes, again, just thinking creatively about how we can engage folks. We have about 10 minutes left, nine or 10 minutes. I'd like each of our presenters to give sort of just a closing statement, if you would, summing up a lot of what we talked about, and we've covered a lot of territory in 50 minutes here. So Parul, would you take a crack at just a summary, and then we'll turn it over to Paul?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you, Mark. This has been fantastic. I love talking about finding ways to evolve, and so that comes in so many shapes and forms. So this has been great. So thank you. And Paul, always awesome. This has been great to get to know you and work with you through this. But here's what I would say. I think that as we look towards tomorrow, we have to be willing to let go of how it was yesterday, because yesterday no longer fits the model for tomorrow. And in that understanding, it's that willingness to listen, to care, and to figure out how to, stitch together the fabric of your organization. Because if you do, the rewards, at least from what I've seen in my own experience with clients and just working in the workforce, it yields rewards because people feel like there is a shared camaraderie. If you don't, you will likely lose some of your best people. And it's one of those things that once those dominoes fall, it's really hard to set them all back up. So I would just really urge, leaders, organizations, anyone on this call, if you have the ability to listen and to kind of keep your head facing forward, not rear view, just front view, I think that there's a lot of success to be had. The pendulum will come back to the middle. We all just have to be willing to help it get there.
Great final thoughts. Appreciate it. Paul?
Well, again, I just want to echo what Parul said. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Parul. This has been very grateful to have been invited to participate. A few final thoughts. I think people's experience going forward, I think, will be dictated to a large extent by kind of how the leaders of the organizations kind of respond. And I think kind of, whatever you settle on in terms of your working practices and whatever you settle on in terms of how you choose to build your team, I think it's really important that kind of leaders understand the employee experience and kind of what their needs are in coming up with the right solutions. I think we touched on some of this, and Parul and I previously talked about, I think, for teams to be really successful, then things like trust, safety, and vulnerability are really kind of necessary preconditions for effective team connections. And if you are looking at doing team building, those things need to be the backdrop for that team building to work. And then just final thing I would say about hybrid working and about getting people on the same page. The one thing that I have seen that doesn't work is when people do go back into the office and the leader says, "Oh, thank goodness we don't have to use that Zoom nonsense anymore." They're really sending a message which says, that whatever solutions we come up with for hybrid, real work only really happens here. And I think that's missing so many opportunities, not only around kind of things you could get done with existing teams, but making your workplace more attractive to attract talent. So I would end it there.
Perfect. I'd like to take the last couple of minutes that we have to ask both Parul and Paul to give us, so that we make sure that we get it on the recording, contact information, website, any email address, anything like that, so that it's on the recording when we send it out to all our participants. Parul, would you go first, please?
Sure. So my organization is PSA Executive Coaching, and the best way to get me is one of two. Email is Parul, Parul, at psaexeccoaching.com, or I'm going to put it out there, my cell phone. It's my lifeline. It's 610-952-8254.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Parul.
Of course.
Paul, would you do the same, please?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So probably easiest way of getting me is email. Although this email is really long-winded, and I probably wouldn't have gone for it had I realized way back when. But it's Paul at on and up coaching, which is meant to be a reflection on In and Out Burgers, which is kind of how the name came about. And On and Up Coaching is ONNUPCOACHING.com. And yeah, that's probably the best way of reaching me. I'll put out my my number as well, if that's helpful. It's 302-559-8883. And I'm on kind of all sorts of platforms, so you can WhatsApp me or text me or whatever works.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to thank our presenters today. They did an excellent job. An action-packed 1 hour of hopefully a lot of good information for all the employers out there. And also I'd like to thank all our participants today. Like I said earlier, we have recorded this. We'll stop the recording in a couple of moments when we shut down, and we'll make sure that all the participants get a copy of that. And you have now Paul and Parul's contact information. So I appreciate everybody's time. Parul and Paul, for the effort that went into the preparation for this. Thank you so much. And for all our participants, I appreciate your time today. So everyone have a great day. We're going to shut down now.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.